we did move on. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chaturvedi. Good morning to all of you.
Good morning.
Following our usual practice, we have designated one of the participants to introduce Dr. V. Siddhartha, who is the former secretary of the Science Advisory Council to the Prime Minister of India. So I'd ask and here to introduce.
Thank you. It's a great honor to introduce Dr. Siddhartha. Okay, that's a brief info about him. A PhD from the Imperial College of Science and Technology, London, and a graduate in Mechanical Engineering from Indian Institute of Technology, Madras. Dr. Siddhartha was a former Secretary of Science Advisory Council to the Prime Minister of India. He has served with different arms of nations, science and technology system, including the Indian Space Research Organization, the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, the Defense Research and Development Organization, as well as the Department of Science and Technology. Dr. Siddhartha is a member of Aeronautical Society of India and of the United Service Institution of India, as also of several technology associations and bodies. He has served on the editorial board of the journal Current Science of the Indian Academy of Sciences. During 2007 and 2009, Siddhartha served on invitation of the Secretary General of the United Nations as a member of the expert group in New York of the Committee of UN Security Council Resolution 1540. He has been twice consultant to the Ministry of External Affairs, Government of India on export control and science and technology issues and international security, and on the Indian VMD Act 25. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I've been very interested to meet this very distinguished person. I've never met him before, and I'm rather surprised to find myself in that position. But never mind. The purpose of this presentation of mine is, as the DG said in the beginning, is to present what is basically an alternative view. This was generated, I think that it's important to appreciate right at the beginning that we're talking about a situation where the international political economy, having been decolonized after the Second World War, recolonized with globalization, and then having got into trouble with that, the idea is, in my judgment, that there is an attempt, beginning with language, to recolonize the mind. And the recolonization of the mind of those who have been decolonized physically, largely represented around this table, is a very subtle ongoing program, and the basic theme of this presentation, which will come out towards the end, I hope, is to caution everyone around this room to be careful of rich people bringing gifts. And that will be the basic theme of what I have to say for the rest of this presentation. It's not negative, and it's not my intention to be negative, but it's my intention to provide an alternative which could form the basis of a South-South cooperative arrangement in science and technology diplomacy without any overlays of neo-colonialist thinking. So, what does this new lexicon look like? The theme is this: diplomacy as one is taught at entry into any training school for diplomats, is the primary means of statecraft designed to effect the non-military ends of the state. Science diplomacy is about harnessing science and scientists as individuals to the practice of diplomacy. It came to prominence when scientists smoothened diplomatic negotiations between the principal Cold War adversaries, the United States and then Soviet Union, to shape the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and other arms control treaties since. Not to be sneezed at. It was quite a worthwhile thing to do, but it had certain other effects, and I'll come to that. The irony in that legacy, namely this one, which came about as a result of the negotiations between the two superpowers towards the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. The irony in that legacy is that the NNPT was negotiated in the late 60s between adversarial superpowers to give effect to their shared interest to stymie and control the spread of nuclear weapons and their enabling technologies to, in particular, the states of the global south. Didn't want any yellows and browns and quasis entering their territory. And so it's no surprise that one finds quasi-military epithets for scientific diplomacy in some North media, such as un coup revenant de la diplomatie scientifique de la France, a winning shot of scientific diplomacy of France. Given those origins and some current modes of the use of the expression science diplomacy, South states should perhaps consider eschewing the expression altogether, if only to preempt neo-colonial attitudes creeping into their science diplomacy with co-South states, and that of course includes India. Something that I've been attempting to get our ministries of science and technology to please pay some attention to. Therefore, you eschew these soft kill expressions. Science for diplomacy, diplomacy for science, even science diplomacy. Use this short form theme descriptor would be my advice. Science in diplomacy with those hyphens. Those hyphens are important. And when you do that, that is when you put in a hyphen there, you come to a morphological distinction that needs to be made between international collaborations in scientific and technological fields and science and technology in foreign policy. You could hyphenate that as well. When the findings of science or the use of technology may have ramifications for international relations beyond the S or T themselves, then the pursuit of the S or control over the use, the limit of the denial of even some self-developed technology, are influenced by foreign policy. And I'll come to this business about the denial of use of even self-developed technology a little later, and possibly even in discussion. So you now have science and technology in diplomatic engagements, and that ampersand represents a conjunction. It's not science and technology, it's science and technology. When a quid pro quo is negotiated in return for a country's participation as a state, using her scientific or other technological or other advantages, such as, for example, in our case, we have a locational advantage of the United Nations-sponsored Tumba Equatorial Rocket Logic Station at the magnetic equator, which happens to pass through the south of India, near the southern tip. It's an Indian state called Kerala, where we started our space program. Excuse me. You have an epidemiological advantage sometimes in who sponsored vaccine trials in tropical Latin America, or technological contributions in kind of subsistence. For example, for the square kilometre array in South Africa, to which there is an international collaborative effort, and we have contributed to that, and so has China and many other countries. South Africa, of course, has contributed to location, plus some other facilities. And the reciprocal use from some facilities. We have one of the world's largest radio telescopes. It's called GMRT, the Giant Meter Wave Radio Telescope. It's in a location not far from Mumbai, on the west coast of India, not far from a little place called, well, no longer little, called Pune. And it's a giant array, and if you go to the website, you can find some very nice pictures. And Arecibo, which is in Puerto Rico, which our friend, the President of the United States, Mr. Trump, had to be reminded was part of the United States. And we have these reciprocal use of facilities between us here at Pune and Arecibo. Part of that is diplomatic, but most of it is undertaken by scientists themselves. So, and although the scientists undertake those reciprocal use of facilities, the initial negotiations for such use is usually, and certainly in our case, was effected by diplomats. And of course, there are excuse me, non-reciprocal offers of certain unique facilities. For example, there is an infrared telescope in the newly formed Union Territory of India in Ladakh, which is next to the Chinese border. You might call that soft power. Science-informed diplomacy, again with that hyphen, is as human threats to the global commons become ever more severe, global diplomatic negotiations over treaty-based national actions to mitigate them become increasingly underpinned by a common transnational appreciation of the underlying science. There are two hardly known Indian traces to international science-informed diplomatic negotiations. One was the Kothari report, I believe a copy is available in the library here, on the effects of nuclear explosions, which was commissioned by Jawaharlal Nehru and involved a team which went all the way to Japan and came back and produced this report. That resulted, because of the effects of these nuclear explosions, the direct result of that was a limited test ban treaty, which resulted in a ban on nuclear explosions in the atmosphere. Could be traced to specifically that report and the field work that was done by a group of scientists who went from India to Japan. And there is also the thing called the Kulkarni Ramanathan work, late 1940s, when we were still not independent, on the vertical transport of ozone in the atmosphere. You go to the web, you'll find several papers on that, and that eventually resulted ozone CFC chemistry, and of course then the Montreal Protocol. We trace back to the work in the late 1940s, about 1948 or thereabouts, even earlier, on the vertical transport of ozone. Ramanathan, for those of you who are familiar with the name of his teacher, a man called C.V. Raman, one of our Nobel Prize, just about the only one in physics, was a student of his. Then there is what I call science-disdained diplomacy. In the oceans and space, commons as these domains are usable by all nations. Now the oceans are ecologically fragile and getting more so. We all know that. Despite the urgings of the scientific community of the United States itself, the domestic ideological opposition there has been dominant enough to prevent the formal accession of the US to UNCLOS. although there have been statements made that they will follow the UNCLOS guidelines and so on. But there's a story behind that, about what they did to the Maldives, and we'll come to that. And the sustainable use of space demands that science-informed actions and inactions of the few nations that have autonomous capabilities to access and use their commons. This is important. But the disdainful of the possible restraint on its freedom of action in a contested domain, which is space, the US has declared quite flatly, space is not a commons. The statement you will find in the United States State Department. It's on the web. This is what I call science disdained diplomacy. That is diplomacy conducted in international fora to assert a certain power imbalance despite global understanding amongst scientists that the science says otherwise. In the cyber commons, capabilities and expertise needed to mount cyber attacks and counter cyber attacks are more evenly resident in North and South nations. The richer the offended nation, the greater its economic and political pain. Quite obvious. We've heard all about cyber attacks, Iran, this, that, all over the newspapers. Some of it completely false. Now, what happened was, quite not too far ago, I think about 2 years ago, ASEAN, 3 years ago, ASEAN countries have harnessed their cyber scientists and information technology specialists to build capacity and confidence amongst themselves. It's a very important South-South arrangement, worth studying. When the diplomatic track to evolve regional cyber CVMs have run into roadblocks, that is, the diplomats asserted their national identities and their national purposes and their national interests as they saw them as diplomats, but the scientists working behind the scenes amongst themselves between these countries forced their diplomats to say, look, if you don't get your acts together, we're all going to suffer for the following technical reasons. They eventually worked something out. But research is accelerating to exploit quantum physics to segregate the cyber commons into quantum haves and quantum have-nots, with technology controls to ensure that this distinction stays that way. There have been shifts in the geography of science, as there have been shifts earlier on in the geography of political power, post-colonialism, post the Second World War, and post the demise of colonialism. There are certain consequences of this for, within quotes, science diplomacy. The US and Europe, they established science superpowers, have dominated the research world since 1945. Yet this Atlantic axis is unlikely to be the main focus of research by 2045 or even by 2020. That is now, today. And there's some evidence of this. This was in Nature, which is a widely read international journal of 18 October 2012. And the thought behind it would have been 2 years before, so let's say a decade, roughly. So within a decade, you have this, but please note the kind of words which are being used. Atlantic axis, military expression. Science superpower, another military type expression. As countries of the South enlarge their scientific spheres of influence, diplomacy will play an increasing role in their SNT-mediated international engagement with the North, of course, and intra-South. And in preparation, the respective roles in science diplomacy of their foreign offices, SNT ministries, UNICITS, Latin America, and similar institutions will likely need more purposeful definition. Thank you.